Lauren wasn't the kind of person to take risks. At 29, she had a stable career as a graphic designer, a small circle of close friends, and a love for solo hikes that helped her decompress from the constant hum of city life. She loved how the trails let her disconnect, no screens, no deadlines, just her and the rhythm of her boots on the dirt. That Saturday, she decided to try a new route, one she'd heard about from a coworker. The Ridge Loop, they'd said, is beautiful at sunset. Hardly anyone knows about it. The idea of solitude appealed to her, especially after a draining week of client revisions. Lauren arrived at the trailhead around 5 p.m. The parking lot was empty, except for an old, rusted pickup truck parked at the edge. She hesitated for a moment but shrugged it off. It was probably a ranger's vehicle. The trail started easy, winding gently uphill through tall pines. The golden hour light filtered through the trees, painting everything in warm hues. Lauren felt the tension in her shoulders melt away. She didn't mind that her phone had no signal, she had her map, a flashlight, and plenty of water. After about an hour, the trail became steeper, and the woods denser. The golden light faded into a muted gray as the sun dipped lower. She glanced at her watch. 6:30. If she picked up the pace, she could finish the loop before dark. That's when she heard it. A faint rustling sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. Lauren stopped, her heart quickening. She scanned the trees but saw nothing. Probably a deer, she told herself. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She pressed on, walking faster now. The trail narrowed, the trees closing in on either side. The rustling came again, closer this time. She whipped around, her breath catching. "Hello," she called, her voice steady despite the growing unease. Silence. Lauren took a deep breath and kept walking, her ears straining for any sound. She reminded herself she wasn't far from the trailhead. Then, she saw it. A single boot print, fresh in the dirt, pointing in the opposite direction. Her stomach sank. She hadn't passed anyone, and there were no signs of another hiker. The print was large, too large to be hers, and the dirt around it looked disturbed, as if whoever had made it had been pacing. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to keep moving. The trail began to descend, leading her into a shadowy valley where the air felt colder. Her flashlight cast long, flickering beams ahead of her. That's when she saw the tent. It was pitched haphazardly, off to the side of the trail, barely visible in the dim light. The fabric was faded and torn, as if it had been there for years. A faint smell of mildew and decay wafted toward her. "Anyone there?" she called, her voice trembling now. No response. Lauren's instinct screamed at her to keep going, but curiosity got the better of her. She stepped closer, her flashlight beam revealing a small opening in the tent. Inside, she saw a pile of clothes, dirty and torn, along with a single, well-worn hiking boot. Something moved behind her. She spun around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. A shadow darted between the trees, too quick for her to make out. "Who's there?" she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. The woods were silent, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. She backed away from the tent and started running, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail seemed longer than she remembered, twisting and turning in ways that didn't feel familiar. Her flashlight flickered, threatening to go out. Suddenly, she tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. Pain shot through her ankle as she scrambled to her feet. That's when she heard it, a low, raspy voice, barely above a whisper. Lauren. Her name. She froze, her mind racing. How could anyone know her name? She didn't wait to find out. Limping now, she pushed herself forward, the trail blurring in her vision. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Finally, she saw the parking lot. Relief flooded her as she spotted her car. But as she got closer, her heart sank. The old pickup truck was gone. On her car's windshield was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "See you next time." Lauren didn't look back as she sped down the mountain road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She never went hiking alone again. Jake wasn't a thrill-seeker. At 32, he preferred comfort over chaos, weekend barbecues, a good craft beer, and the occasional hike to stay in shape. But his best friend, Mike, was the opposite. "Come on," Mike had said, grinning like a kid, "we're doing Wolf's Hollow Trail tonight. It's supposed to be insane under the full moon." Jake hesitated. Wolf's Hollow wasn't your average hiking trail. Stories circulated about people hearing strange noises, seeing figures in the woods, or even disappearing altogether. Still, Mike had a way of pulling him into things, and Jake figured it was better than another night of scrolling through his phone. By the time they parked at the trailhead, the moon was high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the dense forest. Mike, armed with his overconfidence and a dim flashlight, led the way. Jake followed, already questioning his decision. "Relax," Mike said, noticing Jake's unease. "It's just trees and dirt. Nothing to worry about." The trail was narrow, bordered by towering pines that seemed to swallow the light. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Even the chirping of crickets faded, leaving only the crunch of their boots on the dirt path. "Why do they call it Wolf's Hollow, anyway?" Jake asked, trying to distract himself. "Something about an old legend," Mike replied. "Supposedly, a hermit lived out here ages ago, trapping wolves and doing weird stuff with them. People say he never left." Jake rolled his eyes. "Of course. Always a creepy story." After about an hour of hiking, they reached a clearing. The trees gave way to a wide, open space with a large, flat rock in the center. Mike flopped down on the rock, pulling out a water bottle. "See?" "Nothing scary," Mike said, grinning. Jake was about to respond when he noticed something odd. Around the edge of the clearing, the trees were marked with strange symbols, circles, crosses, and jagged lines etched into the bark. "Do you see this?" Jake asked, pointing to one of the carvings. Mike glanced over and shrugged. "Probably just some bored kids messing around." Jake wasn't so sure. The carvings looked old, the lines weathered but precise. As he inspected one closer, he realized there was dried sap, or was it something else, dripping from the marks. Then, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a low hum, but it grew louder, more distinct, a rhythmic thumping, like heavy footsteps coming from the trees. Jake froze. "Do you hear that?" Mike stood, his expression shifting from casual to concerned. "Yeah. Maybe it's an animal." The thumping grew closer, accompanied by a faint whispering. Jake couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like multiple voices, overlapping and urgent. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice tight. Mike nodded, and they started back toward the trail. But after only a few steps, they realized something was wrong. The path was gone. "Wait, we came this way, right?" Mike said, spinning around. Jake's stomach sank. The trail they had followed so easily now seemed to vanish into the forest. Every direction looked the same, dense trees and shadowy undergrowth. The whispering grew louder, circling them. Jake turned his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam seemed swallowed by the darkness. "Mike, this isn't funny," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I'm not doing anything," Mike snapped. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, Jake thought it was a man, tall, hunched, and shrouded in a tattered cloak. But as it stepped closer, the light revealed something else. Its face was obscured by what looked like a mask made of animal bones, and its hands were clawed, as if they belonged to some creature rather than a human. "Run," Jake whispered. They bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at their faces and arms. The figure didn't chase them, but the whispering followed, growing louder, more frantic. After what felt like hours, they burst into another clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone structure, like the remnants of an old cabin. "This wasn't here before," Mike panted, doubling over. Jake didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the doorway, where a faint light flickered. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer, drawn by the glow. "Jake, don't," Mike hissed, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. Inside the cabin, the walls were covered in the same symbols they'd seen on the trees. In the center of the room was a crude wooden altar, and on it lay a small, bloodied object, something that looked disturbingly like a wolf's paw. Jake turned to leave, but the doorway was gone. "Mike," he shouted, pounding on the wall where the door had been. From the shadows, the whispering grew deafening. Jake spun around, his flashlight flickering, and saw the figure standing in the corner, motionless. "Why are you doing this?" Jake screamed. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, and then stepped forward. Jake closed his eyes, bracing for whatever was coming. When he opened them, he was standing in the parking lot, alone. Mike's car was gone, along with any sign they had been on the trail. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. A single message appeared on the screen. "You made it. For now." Emma loved the outdoors. At 29, she found hiking and camping to be her escape from the pressures of city life. After a rough breakup, she decided to take a solo trip to Clear Lake Trail, a remote hiking spot nestled deep in the mountains. It was known for its pristine views and solitude, a perfect place to clear her head. The trailhead was nearly empty when Emma arrived that morning. She strapped on her pack, adjusted her boots, and set off. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds. She felt a tinge of relief as she left the noise of civilization behind. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Emma had reached her planned campsite near the lake. It was breathtaking, a still body of water reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun, surrounded by towering pines. She set up her tent, built a small fire, and settled in with a cup of instant coffee. As the stars appeared one by one, Emma felt the kind of peace she hadn't experienced in months. But just as she began to relax, she noticed something strange. Across the lake, another campfire flickered to life. She hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. There were no other cars in the parking lot, and Clear Lake wasn't exactly a popular destination. Emma tried to convince herself it was fine. Maybe someone had arrived earlier and hiked in from a different trailhead. Still, she couldn't shake a growing unease. The fire across the lake seemed off. It didn't flicker naturally. The flames were steady, almost like they were controlled. She squinted, trying to make out any movement, but the campsite remained eerily still. As the hours passed, Emma forced herself to focus on her book, trying to ignore the fire. But then she heard it, a faint whistle, high-pitched and melodic, coming from the direction of the lake. Emma froze. It wasn't a bird or an animal. It sounded human. She stood and stepped closer to the water's edge, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whistle continued, now joined by faint ripples on the surface of the lake. "Hello," Emma called, her voice trembling. The whistling stopped. Her flashlight caught something on the opposite shore, a figure standing just beyond the glow of the fire. It was too far away to make out details, but the figure was tall, unmoving, and seemed to be facing her. Emma's heart raced. She stumbled back to her campsite, doused her fire, and zipped herself into her tent, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe someone else was out here, just like her, looking for peace and quiet. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she thought she heard the faint whistle, now closer, circling her campsite. When morning finally came, Emma packed up quickly, deciding to cut her trip short. As she hiked back toward the trailhead, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made her jump. About halfway back, she noticed something strange. A trail marker, one she was sure she'd passed the day before, had been altered. Instead of the usual arrows pointing toward the trailhead, it had been scratched out, replaced with the crudely carved message. "Keep going." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She quickened her pace, her breathing shallow. As she neared the parking lot, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her car was still there, just as she'd left it. But as she unlocked the door, she noticed something on the windshield, a piece of paper, weighed down by a small stone. The note read, "You weren't supposed to leave." Her hands shook as she crumpled the paper and threw it into the car. She sped away, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure from the lake standing in the middle of the road. For weeks after, Emma couldn't shake the memory of that night. She tried searching online for stories about Clear Lake Trail but found nothing unusual. No disappearances, no strange legends. But then, a few months later, she saw a news article. "Hiker missing near Clear Lake Trail." The photo showed a young man, smiling and carefree. Emma's stomach sank as she recognized him. He had been the figure standing across the lake, staring into her campfire. She closed her laptop and decided she was done with hiking for good. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she swore she could still hear that faint, haunting whistle. Jason was an experienced hiker. At 32, he had conquered some of the most challenging trails in the country. But when his friend Tyler dared him to attempt a solo hike along Devil's Ridge, a trail infamous for its dangerous terrain and eerie legends, Jason couldn't resist. The stories surrounding Devil's Ridge were well known among hikers. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, others spoke of shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. Jason dismissed it all as campfire tales meant to scare rookies. He set out early, the trailhead bathed in golden morning light. The path was narrow and winding, hugging steep cliffs on one side and dense forest on the other. Jason made good time, stopping occasionally to snap photos of the breathtaking views. By late afternoon, the trail became more treacherous. Rocks loosened underfoot, and the forest grew darker as the sun dipped lower. Jason decided to push on, wanting to reach a flat clearing known as Widow's Peak before nightfall. It was the only safe place to set up camp. As he climbed, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant wail. Jason tightened his jacket and pressed on. When he finally reached Widow's Peak, the sun was just a sliver on the horizon. The clearing was smaller than he'd expected, with jagged rocks jutting out like teeth. He quickly pitched his tent, eager to settle in before darkness fully enveloped the ridge. As he ate his dinner, Jason noticed the wind had stopped. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. He shrugged it off and crawled into his tent, determined to get some rest. Jason woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, circling his tent. He froze, listening intently. "Hello," he called out. The footsteps stopped. Jason grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The clearing was empty. Just as he started to retreat back inside, his flashlight caught something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, staring out into the void. "Hey!" Jason called, stepping out of the tent. The figure didn't move. Jason approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. But as he neared, he realized there was no one there. Confused, he scanned the area, but the figure had vanished. Suddenly, Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to see his tent, illuminated by the flashlight's glow. The fabric was covered in scratch marks that hadn't been there before. The next morning, Jason decided to abandon the hike. He packed up quickly, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. The trail felt different on the way down, quieter, darker, and somehow longer. About an hour in, he came across something strange, a pile of stones in the middle of the path. Each rock was marked with a strange symbol, etched crudely as if by hand. Jason had never seen anything like it. He took a photo with his phone, intending to research it later, and stepped around the pile. As he continued, Jason felt a growing sense of unease. The trees seemed to close in, and the air grew heavy. He began hearing whispers, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. "Hello," he called again, his voice shaky. The whispers stopped. Jason quickened his pace, his heart pounding. Then he saw it, another pile of stones, identical to the first. He was sure he hadn't turned back, but the sight made his stomach drop. Had he been walking in circles? Jason pulled out his map and compass, trying to get his bearings. But the compass needle spun erratically, refusing to settle. Panic set in. He decided to leave the trail entirely, cutting through the forest in a straight line. He knew this was risky, but staying on the trail felt even more dangerous. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing around him. Jason stumbled through the undergrowth, branches clawing at his clothes. He felt like he was being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. When he finally burst out of the forest, he wasn't at the trailhead. Instead, he stood in a clearing with a single, ancient tree at its center. Hanging from the tree's gnarled branches were dozens of trinkets, rusted keys, broken watches, and pieces of fabric. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized the trinkets weren't random. They were personal items, weathered by time. A low groan echoed through the clearing, and Jason turned to see the figure again, closer this time, its face obscured by shadow. "Who are you? What do you want?" Jason shouted, his voice breaking. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the tree. Jason followed its gesture and saw something that made his blood run cold, a hiking pack, identical to his, hanging from one of the branches. Jason didn't wait to see more. He bolted back into the forest, running blindly. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony. When he finally stumbled out onto a road, he collapsed in relief. A passing car stopped, and an older couple helped him inside. "You're lucky," the driver said as they sped away. "People don't usually make it out of Devil's Ridge." Jason didn't respond. He couldn't stop thinking about the pack hanging from the tree, and the scratches on his tent. That night, as he tried to sleep in the safety of his apartment, he heard the whispers again. And they were coming from inside the room.